Welcome to the session today on common security, public voices and expert insight. So today's session, we have a series of 4 mini panels for you where in groups of 2 experts will talk about some of the questions we're going to put to them. There's paramount public concern on issues that come out from the reports and things we see in our own daily lives about issues such as disinformation, democratic resilience, community cohesion, economic well-being, and these issues really were identified in the community consultations. So today, my name is Nicola Rosenblum. I'm from the Department of Defence, and I'm here to moderate this panel, which will touch on those issues. We're going to look at a range of different civil society perspectives. We also have people who have a range of different government backgrounds. Some of our experts were part of the community consultations, others were part of the process of reviewing the data. So they all come with different perspectives today. I'll talk quickly through the bios of each of the panellists so you know who we have on stage, and then I'm going to dive into those mini panels. So our first mini interviews are Dr. Jennie Barrera and Professor Sora Park. Dr. Jennie Barrera is the CEO of the Wyndham Community and Education Centre and has worked with migrants, refugees and humanitarian entrants since 1979 across education, employment and settlement services. She contributes long-standing leadership in multiculturalism, social cohesion and community engagement, supported by multiple awards recognising her impact. Professor Sora Park is the Director of the News and Media Research Centre as an International Communications Association Fellow, focusing on digital media users, media markets and media policy, with a special emphasis on digital and social exclusion. Sora leads the annual Digital News Report, Australia, and examines how technology shapes the distribution of opportunities and privileges in society. Our second panellists are Holly Rankin and Tom Rogers. Tom spoke to you on several of the panels yesterday. Holly is an artist and strategist working at the intersection of culture, politics and public affairs, and she's known nationally as the ARIA-nominated recording artist Jack River. Holly mobilises community, culture and public advocacy to drive systematic changes across human rights, political integrity and climate and regional resilience. Tom is the former Australian Electoral Commissioner, a member of the Advisory Board for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. Our third mini panel is Warwick Carter and Paul Myler. Warwick Carter has led the Perth Southwest Metropolitan Alliance since 2022, driving regional projects and advocacy across one of Australia's fastest growing corridors. Warwick brings over 2 decades of experience in town planning, economic development and governance, supported by leadership roles in local government and specialist committee work on infrastructure, environmental and social governance practices. Paul is the founder and CEO of StratQ and a former Deputy Ambassador at the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC, with more than 30 years diplomatic experience, including service as Australia's ambassador to Russia. Paul contributes expertise in global political risk, national resilience, and Indo-Pacific strategic affairs, shaped through strategic senior diplomatic roles and work on AUKUS, trusted supply chains, and major power competition. Our fourth mini panel is Jennie Whalen and Chris Flynn. Dr. Jennie Whalen is currently the head of strategic policy at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Prior to this role, Jennie was First Assistant Secretary, leading the Office of Community Cohesion and Strengthening Democracy Task Force in the Department of Home Affairs, working to strengthen Australia's cohesion and democratic resilience. Jennie is a former Chief Strategy Officer at the Paul Ramsay Foundation, with prior government, academic and policy roles across a range of different agencies, New South Wales and Queensland government, and several leading think tanks. Chris Flynn, our final panellist, is one of Australia's leading energy and infrastructure lawyers and strategic advisors, specialising in energy, critical infrastructure, defence, space, telecommunications and complex cross-border transactions. Chris has worked in more than 60 countries, formerly co-headed energy and power and sovereign energy at a global law firm, and serves on the advisory board of the Law Futures Centre at Griffith University. So we have an incredibly impressive range of panellists here for you today that will talk about a range of different issues. So the first mini panel will focus on the information environment and misinformation. We've heard a lot in the last day and a half already about misinformation, about what is said in the community report, about concerns about misinformation, but also how agencies are responding to it. So my first question for Sora and Jennie is, trust in institutions has declined in many democracies. How much of the misinformation problem is really a trust problem?
Maybe I'll go first.
Thanks, Sora.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sora Park, and I've been studying news audiences for a very long time. So most of my comments will be from an audience's perspective. So if we think about the problem of trust and misinformation from the perspective of an audience member, like an individual, you're situated in an online environment that is very cluttered. You don't know what to trust. There's lots of dubious information scams. And in that situation, there are two ways to go around it. First is, well, do I have a trusted source and can I go and check the fact with my trusted source? Or if you don't have a trusted source, most people just disengage, say, this is too much for me, it's too exhausting, I will not engage with this topic. So that's what we found with our news audience study. So there is a direct relationship between the amount of misinformation that you see online and people's trust. If you don't have a trusted source, it leads to disengagement. And we've also seen that people who have access to quality news regularly and trust news sources are much more likely to be able to identify misinformation. And we tested both people's ability to identify misinformation and their confidence. And news consumption is the strongest predictor of both ability and confidence in identifying misinformation.
Thanks, Sora. Jennie?
Thank you. I want to say up front that I'm not an expert in misinformation or disinformation, so what I'll talk about today came out of the group discussion that we were involved in. So I'll give you some real examples of how misinformation and disinformation play out in my community. I think it's important to have some context of my community because our group discussion was very micro, it was very local, and this morning we've heard a lot about national and global type perspectives. I want to really hone in on the very small micro level communities that are around the country. So Wyndham, City of Wyndham in Melbourne's outer west is fast growing, one of the most diverse local government areas in the country. We've had over 300% population growth over 30 years. We're currently at over 330,000 in population. We will grow to 500,000, bigger than some capital cities by 2040. We have 5 out of the 10 most diverse suburbs in the country. That was borne out through the 2021 census. In some of our suburbs, we have 80% of the population were born overseas, and we have a significant number of refugee and humanitarian entrants coming in under Australia's program. We have a very young community. We have a community that has lived experience of conflict, displacement, distrust, and trauma. The work that we do at the organisation I work for, which has been around for 50 years, the majority of the work is around settlement services, so settling new arrivals into the country, finding them employment, helping them to learn English, housing, get their kids into school and so on. So I would say over my experience of 45 years, trust is not automatic with local communities. It's built over time. It's always fragile. It's built incrementally. And where it's weak, misinformation and disinformation multiplies. In 2025, for us, it was a year like I've never known in my career. We had a situation where we lost more than 30 young people over the year to violence. 25 of those young people came from one particular community. There were lots of complex reasons why that happened, but the effect and the violence was increased by misinformation and disinformation that was circulating on social media and on various other platforms, as well as through AI-generated messages that people were receiving. The misinformation was spread rapidly, and those messages were received much quicker than messages from authorities. So by the time we were dealing with the outcomes of what was being distributed, sometimes it was too late. It was incredibly stressful for our local community. Fortunately, we had already built relationships with some agencies and authorities within our community because we've been a primary settlement area for a long time. But the speed at which we had to work to counter the messages that were being distributed was incredible. And as I said, I've never seen anything like it in 45 years. People stopped sending their children to school. They stopped wearing their traditional dress, which identified them. They stopped catching public transport. That impacted their parents' work because they were taking time off work to make sure that they were around for their children, that they picked them up wherever they might be. And it took a lot of effort from a lot of agencies, authorities, community leaders to turn it around. So our group discussion focused very much on safety or lack of safety and how people deal with that at the local level.
Thank you, Sora and Jennie, for sharing us some of those thinking around the evidence behind the link between trust and misinformation, and some really practical examples there of where it can go wrong when misinformation spreads. During a crisis such as pandemics, natural disasters, geopolitical tensions, but also local community issues, governments really need to communicate rapidly and credibly. So if we try and think about, where do we look for the positives, what does effective communication look like in this day and age of fragmented media?
Yes, it's so important for governments to relay accurate and trustworthy information, and they have lots and lots of tools to do so nowadays with social media and websites and YouTube and Instagram. But there are a few things that, COVID example showed us is that the government, like some people now trust the government more because of COVID, some trust government less. And that's because the way it was communicated did not talk to all the diverse range of citizens. So I think diversifying the way of communicating to audiences is the first thing that the government might be doing to ensure that everyone gets the message in an accurate way. And to do that, they'd have to build trust first, and which Jennie said, trust building is very, very hard. Losing trust is very easy, but rebuilding it is very, very hard. So it might seem ironic, but in times of crisis or emergency, I think governments and news media or anyone who's communicating to the public, they need to pause and make sure that they're relaying accurate information. Because in times of crisis, it's often the case that you spit out information that is inaccurate and that loses your trust, and it's very hard to recover. So although it's very tempting to roll out information, and news media does that all the time, is to put something out and then correct it, but that's probably a very bad thing for trust. But in times of crisis, you can't not relay information. So what can we do as the government? I think perhaps the government could embrace new technology in a slightly different way, is to embrace not just the tools themselves, but they can network with people who are good at doing it. Like there are lots of small publishers, there are lots of content creators, there are citizens who do have passion for relaying information, and they're trusted sources in the community. We had a small study with ABC Canberra, because they do a lot of emergency broadcasting. We had bushfires, and their practices had changed a lot since the introduction of social media. And the way they embrace it is that they know things on social media could be wrong, but they can't ignore it either. So they try to link with citizens who bring to them trusted sources of information, who are quite reliable, and maintain a network of citizens who can relay accurate information in times of crisis. And that seemed to have worked very well, because those citizens are also very trusted among the community members. So I think the government could open up a little bit in terms of how they communicate that they have to control everything. Rather than that, they need to be able to embrace new technologies, new actors, and build a network of trusted sources.
Jennie?
Yeah, I think I would say act fast and act early about delivering accessible messages. I agree, go to trusted sources. We also saw this in our community during the pandemic. Unless you were someone like me, you weren't listening to the Chief Health Officer. You were ringing my bicultural workers, my multilingual workers. You were ringing them and asking them what to do, what COVID was, what to do, how to deal with it. We were a community hit very early by the pandemic and hit hard because people in our community couldn't work from home and they live in intergenerational families. So we had very young children going to school, catching the virus, bringing it home, infecting grandparents who were living with them. So use community organisations, use trusted voices to deliver those messages during a crisis. It's incredibly important because the information ecosystem gets polluted really, really quickly. There were bad actors telling people not to get vaccinated as well. So sometimes that was coming from certain communities and certain faith groups. So you need the trusted, informed authorities, agencies, community leaders on the ground to work with people. That is who they will go to. And I think the 3 tiers of government could look to utilise those kinds of strategies and policy responses in a much better way. Community leaders are resilient. They work incredibly long and hard hours, but they're there for their communities. So I think formal systems sometimes feel really inaccessible to local people. So use these networks, invest in connections, invest in people-centred and place-based responses.
Thank you so much. I mean, a lot to converge there around the importance of diversifying communications channels, making sure that information is early and fast, but also as accurate as possible. But then also thinking about where are those networks and communities that we can tap into to use to reach further into the communities? Where are the trusted voices? Where are the trusted networks that we might be able to use to penetrate further into the community? Now, trust is an absolute bedrock of democratic resilience, so that leads us nicely into the second panel. Whereas, as I said, we've got Tom Rogers and Holly Rankin. So my first question for Tom and Holly is, which institutions or norms in Australia most strongly protect our democratic stability, and where might vulnerabilities exist?
Do you want to take it away, Tom?
Well, look, no surprises. I might start off by talking about our electoral system as part of our democratic architecture, and critically, the Australian Electoral Commission and its state counterparts are critical to that building of trust. And it is important. You know, trust is the one true coin of the democratic realm. And the AEC looked very closely at what occurred in various overseas democracies. And I don't want to name particular democracies, but, some democracies from our Five Eye partners. And without being specific, and if I looked at some of the issues that they've had there with trust over the years, in my own view as an electoral professional, the problems there were not a problem of administration. It's actually a problem of reputation. And people deliberately, through mis and disinformation, talking down the reputation of electoral systems strikes at the very heart of who we are. It undermines faith in government and undermines the very essence of when we have our say about who governs us. So it's a really critical part of building that trust in outcomes, trust in democracy. And so the risks are very clear, I think, that we're seeing an increasing amount of mis and disinformation. We're only just starting to see the impact of artificial intelligence on democratic architecture. Last year, if I get the dates wrong, I think it was in October or November, it was the first time we've seen a large-scale artificial intelligence attack on a Western election. If you have a look, you can see on the Irish election, there was a deep fake video produced that had an impact on the election. It was also released very, very cleverly in the last 48 hours before polling day, which is that critical issue that's hard to counteract, and it had an impact on their election as well. So I think there are vulnerabilities that we're just working our way through at the moment, but maintaining trust in those systems and in our democratic architecture is critical. And I might just also point out, the democratic architecture is not owned by the AEC, it's owned by all Australians, and all Australians have a role to play with this, including politicians and candidates. And it's incredibly disappointing when you see candidates and politicians talking down our own electoral system or casting doubt on it. I think it's absolutely reprehensible. So we've all got a role to play. In 2023, I think the AEC was rated as the most trusted agency federally, and long may that be the case. We need to maintain that as a society because it's part of our democratic resilience, part of national security and part of our defence.
Certainly, I know that I've watched overseas elections in the last couple of years and been incredibly grateful for our centralised and highly capable electoral system. Holly, over to you on the same question.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And big fan of your work and everything you did to make that institution so trusted. As a young person that has watched those campaigns, I'm very grateful for that. So obviously the pillars of our democracy, we've got government, the legislature and the media, but my interest is in the public square and specifically Generation Z and millennials. Thanks to Sora's work, 88% of young people, 18 to 24-year-olds, consume the majority of their news online. And the majority of those folks have social media as their main source of news. And I don't have a problem or a concern with that they're engaging in news on those platforms. But what really does concern me is the digital public square and the lack of governance, the landscape upon which these conversations are happening. And this is obvious stuff, but this digital landscape is owned by, 6 or so very large foreign companies. And that means that our information ecosystem for young people is at the beck and call of the algorithm, which is ungoverned and unregulated right now, a problem all across the world. But what this creates is an information ecosystem where someone else is setting rules, and whether that's other countries and their interests or corporate interests. And until we know it's a problem, we need to rapidly understand this and engage in solutions, because these foreign actors, whether it's civic or corporate, have many of them have a strategic interest in division, and division disrupts our democracy. And we can talk theoretically, but the numbers are really, really concerning. The volume of information that young people are consuming, the infinite number of channels now with artificial intelligence and AI-generated information. Young people, which is the majority of the Australian electorate now, Gen Z and millennials, are existing in this almost infinite information ecosystem that is completely governed by rules and, roads and highways that are absolutely out of our control here in Australia. So that really concerns me, and there are policy propositions to look at that. So there's the regulatory side of it. But the immediate and available solution is to, at the very least, have government and key agencies and folks like the National Security College enter that space at the scale it requires to have a conversation about the basics, civics, mis and disinformation, national security and our place in the world, because who else is going to bring that information to Australians, young Australians, at the scale it is needed? So yes, there are really important and urgent policy questions, but they won't be solved in time enough to reach these audiences with critical information about the democracy that we still have. And I will say to finish that some of those foreign strategic interests out there are so competent in this space. There's a lot of great data and reports out of the EU especially on the sheer scale of mis and disinformation, but strategic narrative that folks are engaging in. So the tools are there, the teams are there, people are there, and like Sora said, the creators and influencers and digital publishers who do hold the fort in the online digital square, they are ready and willing to engage with government agencies and great organisations like the National Security College to have this conversation with young people. So I'm highly concerned as someone who lives in that world. These young people, they don't watch TV, they don't read the newspapers. So those channels are completely irrelevant to them when it comes to communicating. But yeah, we'll go to solutions in a moment, I'd say.
I mean, I don't think it's only young people these days that are absorbed in the infinite information ecosystem. I know many of you here will have lost a few hours to doom scrolling at some point and will be able to think that infinite information ecosystem resonates with you. So we've talked about, what it can look like when citizens lose confidence in democratic processes through this media environment, which can create vulnerabilities in the system. Tom, to you, what practical steps can strengthen trust in democratic governance? What do you think that government can do? And Holly, because you've already started talking about what government can do, I also wonder for you, what else could civil society, media, academia do in addition to government? But feel free also to jump into those next steps.
I think there's some really simple steps, and let me talk about that for a moment, about education. I mean, we spoke yesterday, there's only 3 things in this space that really can happen. It's regulation, to regulate, moderate or educate, and all the research shows that education is the thing that's going to pay more dividends than anything else. And, I agree fully with Holly about the algorithms and social media companies, and we need to work on that as well. But it's going to be a long-term thing too. But there's some stuff we can do right now. I think that there was some research that emerged in about 22 or 23 from Professor Stephen Finkel in the University of Pittsburgh, and they did one of the largest studies, I think 40,000 people, 33 countries, where they showed really short pro-democratic videos, less than 3 minutes. And then they assessed the impact on audiences after that. And the impact was huge. It made people more pro-democracy and more resistant to messages that arose later on that were authoritarian. So the research shows that it works and it's effectively pre-bunking rather than debunking. It's cheap, it's simple, and it works. So I kind of think that if we owned a house and that house was in danger of some fairly severe structural issues, and someone came along and said, I've got a really simple, cheap, effective plan that's proven to work, you wouldn't launch yet another 5-year study in how you would put this together. You would actually just take some steps to do that now. It's simple and cheap, and that's what we should be investing in, is mammoth digital media and civics literacy for our society, to make sure that all levels of our society, from youngest to the reverse end of that, understand who we are. And it's something we could do tomorrow. And that's the sort of thing we should be doing now to build trust for if something goes wrong. And just to finish off, I was commissioner when we ran the referendum, which was one of the most polarising electoral debates we'd had in Australia for a large number of years. We did a huge amount of work before that. And whilst there was a huge amount of polarisation around the debate, there was none focused on the AEC. And we ran the largest public awareness campaign in Australia's history. No other government agency has ever run anything that large, including the delivery of a booklet to every household that had a bigger distribution than the biggest bestseller that's ever been written in Australia's history. And there was not one complaint about that campaign. But I think part of that was the work we did before the event. to build trust levels in the institution. So I think for me, how do we recover trust and prevent trust in our democratic architecture from collapsing is working now on digital, media and civics literacy and bolstering that in a very cheap and effective way.
Holly, before I throw to you, just Tom, to drill into that a little bit more, where does this pre-bunking happen? Are you talking about in schools? Are you talking about online? Are you talking about leaflets? What does that look like in practice?
Maybe to just come back to the report for a moment, which is excellent. It shows Australians are really concerned about this, and it also shows that Australians are concerned about things that impact on them locally. It needs to be everywhere. I know we're hearing from people from overseas. I think the Finns are a standout example with what they're doing with this. The Swedes are amazing. They've set up an agency called the Psychological Defence Agency, and it's a government agency. They recognise the importance of democratic resilience and community cohesion, and so it needs to occur not just through an organisation like the AEC, but everywhere, right through society, and it should be an underpinning for every single thing that we do, and it's cheap, which is the other thing, so we should be doing it now.
Thanks. And so, Holly, your thoughts on how we can strengthen our democratic resilience?
I'm going to echo you and say, honestly, digital media literacy, communications campaigns at scale, meeting people where they are with trusted messengers that they connect with. But considering this context, the Community Consultations Report really highlights that Australians are so ready and keen to engage with more information about our national security context and our place in the world. And so I would say in this context, it would be honestly game-changing to invest in engaging with Australians at scale and having that conversation where they are. I just know that the people who are able to hold that conversation are ready and willing. And if we don't engage, we're going to have pretty dire consequences. And I will shout out to the European countries who are really leading here, and it's very loud and proud and exciting, just like this report. When you read it, you get excited and it opens up conversations. Like, I get targeted by European Union, national security kind of information campaigns, and I'm sitting here in Australia. So they're doing really well. There's lots of people doing it well out there, and we can rapidly take those tools and those ideas and implement them really soon. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So we've been diving deeply into the digital information space. Now we're going to step back out into the real world, because Warwick and Paul are both from WA. So we're going to spend a few minutes thinking about exactly what WA is thinking about.
Which is the real world, as compared to everything else, right?
So we're going to talk a little bit about WA and what it thinks about in terms of resilience and national security. So WA, we're talking about a relatively small population compared to some of the other population centres on the eastern coast. We're talking about a state that has huge investment through the mining industry, which is absolutely vital to the Australian economy, but which also really ties the state into some of those large Asian economies in our region. And we're now seeing new investment through defence industry, through AUKUS, which is also really vital to Australia's concept of national defence and our strategy of deterrence. So my first question to Warwick and Paul is, how does WA think about resilience and securing our future?
Look, thanks for that. To put it in context, I work for a corridor of Perth, so the southwest corridor of Perth. It's about 500,000 people in there. We are currently looking at a infrastructure spend from government of around $60 billion over the next 20 to 30 years. Defence makes up a portion of that. So we have new ports, new roads, all sorts of infrastructure uplift happening, as well as a new shipyard and the uplift at HMA Stirling. So what we sort of find in WA is we know there's a Canberra bubble, but there's also a bit of a WA bubble. We don't communicate well, and that's on us as well as on Canberra. But a lot of the messaging that has come out around the defence investment hasn't particularly landed well into that corridor, because in some states, they are very excited about the defence spend. It's going to underwrite that economy. In the area we're coming into, where I am, we've got 3% unemployment. So we see this as another mega project, and we go, okay, we'll put that there for a minute, and then we'll work out how we're going to deal with it. So it's a different sort of conversation to happen. So what hasn't been happening to date is that conversation with the community about why this is important. AUKUS was something that was agreed upon, and we were told about it, but we weren't given the narrative about why it was important to the WA to Australia, and why Western Australia was in particular a key part of that. So it's just been a misstep at the beginning with the communication to help bring the community on that journey, because I think once you do understand what it is about and what it will do for Australia and the opportunities that come with it, it is actually a very exciting program, but it hasn't landed well. So it's just that conversation is that, do you need to speak slowly to Western Australians? Well, yeah, maybe. But it's just reframing the conversation, saying, look, we know there's a lot happening here already, but we need this to be happening in this region as well.
Well, I agree with Warwick almost all the time, and then I pivot slightly. So I do think once we started having the discussion with the West Australian community about why on AUKUS, and I agree with Warwick that it took a little bit of time to get going, but when you start sort of pointing out that we're the fifth largest user of commercial shipping globally, that 98% of our information travels through submarine cables, et cetera, that all of the wealth of, or a large proportion of the wealth of Australia and certainly of Western Australia is located either offshore, off the Northwest Shelf, or is accessible by very complicated ports up in Port Hedland, and so is extremely vulnerable to disruption. And I think the West Australian public, when we get to the bits in the study where we talk about the public seeing single points of failure and how easy it is to shut down the Australian economy, the West Australians community is very focused on that. So I think they're there. I think the challenge is the risks that they identified, they don't see the government solving, and part of that was not really doing enough to explain why AUKUS and what you were going to actually use the submarines for example. I think the other point that Warwick makes really, and he sort of undersold it a little bit there, I think the Trade Coast next decade total investment spend is $200 billion worth of projects.
With private sector as well.
With the private sector involved. So you've got $200 billion of investment coming into a strip which is like
7 square kilometres of doing over 1% of Australia's GDP, and then we're going to more than double down on that.
Yeah. And with 3% unemployment already, this is a very crowded, economically hot space. So we as a government want to come into that and say defence industry is really important. It's a great part of diversifying the Australian economy. It's a great part of diversifying the West Australian economy. And the businesses say, yep, we understand that. And then we say, we want you to, part of the government needs you to lean into helping us build this industry as an insurance policy for the government. And the industry says, yep, Brian, we'll do that. And then the government says, we'll give a little bit of money to help you, but essentially we want you to carry the entire risk of uplifting yourself. And you're asking businesses, small businesses, major businesses in Western Australia to convince their boards and their shareholders or their owners that they should put away part of their production, their order book, whatever. Nobody's looking for work in Western Australia, right? All these companies are flat tack trying to support the orders that they've already got. And what we're saying is we want you to open up space in your production for a completely different industry. We think it's important for us, and we think you should do it. And they're sort of saying, so where are the orders then? And how are you going to help us, and how are you going to share the risk with us if you want us to do this, let alone just the management bandwidth to try and get their head around what the defence opportunity is. So I think it's really important that, and this is a little bit superficial, but it's just a different. You walk into Adelaide and say we want to build a defence industry, and everybody says great. Where do I sign up? And that's fair and that's understandable. You walk into Western Australia and you say we want to bring $24 billion worth of investment, and we're going to create 10,000 jobs, and we're going to build a new industry. And literally everybody says, where the hell are we going to find another 10,000 workers? Where are we going to house them? What does that mean for our roads, communities, schools? It's risk management. And it's just a different discussion. And I think the government is starting to get to the place where they understand that, but it's taken a little while.
And so I think that segues really nicely to my next question is, if much of the capability that we need for the defence and national security sector is going to come from private sector, but also relies on the legitimacy of the public, how can government effectively partner with industry and with the community to get the support they need to get these projects moving?
I think we just need to think about cities as a system, and what we're seeing at the moment is commitment to upgrade certain parts of that system. So what we're seeing on HMAS Stirling has transformed over the last few years. It is phenomenal how much has been done there. And when Henderson goes ahead with the shipyard, the plans for that are, they are amazing. They will be world leading what we'll have there. What isn't being uplifted at the same time is the other parts of that system. So the roads going in and out of HMAS Stirling, for those of you who've been on it, you'll know what it's like. It's a goat track. It's a 1960s residential road that was not designed to have Australia's largest naval base at the end of the cul-de-sac. So it's those other little bits and pieces that are missing. It is about trying to bring the rest of the community on the journey, saying, well, if this is being upgraded, we actually need to upgrade other things. And what we've seen is there's other jurisdictions who do that really well. The Americans, for example, are very good at that. They run something called the Defence Community Infrastructure Program. Now, DCIP is about uplifting the rest of a community, but it's really about community resilience. So what they've looked at is saying we've got defence communities where we may have a large proportion of that community deployed from. We need to make sure that that place is resilient in those times, that community feels supported. So they put money into not just community facilities and roads, but they put money into local fire brigades. They put money into mitigate flooding, things like that. They are investing in resilience in those communities. We haven't seen that yet. So I think that's the opportunity for Australia to really copy that fund and be able to brand some of the investments going into these communities about being that uplift. And I think that then helps, it buys that essential social licence. It helps people understand that this is real and recognise that the inconveniences that may come, and we sort of say, look, AUKUS is not to blame for everything, but it will get blamed for everything because you're wearing a uniform, there's people with different accents, etc. You're very visible compared to the mining industry, which is less visible despite them all wearing high-vis. So we see the need for that investment. I think it is looking at those other jurisdictions about how that happens. The other thing I'd say is we get very focused on the conversations about the 3.5% of GDP spent on defence. There's another figure that other people are using, I think it's a NATO figure, which is 5% for national security. Now, that does include resilience in there, and so those sort of investments would go towards that. I think that's a better way to look at some of the investment here. We've heard it from some of the other councils the other day. The amount of money that you would spend on mitigating the issues before they arise is far less than having to treat them at the end. So, to me, investing that way shows to the community this is real. It shows to the to the private sector that it's real. The other way you can do that is through something that we've seen in other parts of Australia, city deals. City deals is what that delivered the Western Sydney Airport. It's a very simple thing. It's an agreement between the three tiers of government, but it's then communicated out to the private sector saying this is real, this is the time frame it's going to happen, and it has annual reporting which says here are the contracts that are about to come up. So that if you're in the private sector, you can go, okay, I can see that in 3 years' time there's going to be a major road upgrade. We will start planning for that and make sure that we have the workforce ready to bid on that piece of work. Communication out to that private sector is really important. I've worked in government 20 years, I've never built a thing. The private sector's always done it for me. I am not confident that we have communicated the scale of what is coming to the private sector for them to be ready to take advantage of that, because we haven't seen the growth of our region that I think we are going to need to see over the next 10 years or so. Mm.
Yeah, and look, I'd just say again, we're being a little bit of a parochial panel, but like the West Australian industry is used to the trauma of cycles, right? So there's there is a real appetite. I mean, we haven't seen a commodity cycle come off for quite a while, and I suspect events in the Middle East will mean we'll be okay for a few more years. But the lived memory of most of business in WA is that there's cycles to activity. So the idea that there's a consistent, reliable, underpinning defence industrial base with a continuous naval ship build, like as part of your portfolio as a business, is really attractive, right? Unfortunately, the lived experience of that is repeated contracts being cancelled on major defence projects or rescoped or reduced or whatever. So we're saying again now, no, this time we've really got continuous naval shipbuilding, we've really got LCMs, LCHs, we've really got the Mogami class frigate coming, we've really got AUKUS, and I am confident that we're actually in the place as a nation where those things are actually really going to happen, and they're going to be consistent, and they're going to go from government to government, and they're not going to be resized or reshaped or whatever. But the business community certainly isn't, because they've had their experience of sort of, okay, we're going to gear up, and then all of a sudden it's 3 hulls, not 8 or whatever. So there's a consistency of message. I mean, if we're going to be in the business of national resilience, then the government needs to show the same resilience in pushing through these capabilities, and from government to government to government, we need to be serious about it being a continuous industry. And then in Western Australia, right, it's you can solve a lot of the challenges that we might have, right? Because, lots of people want to do FIFO for a decade. Most people don't want to do FIFO for 3 decades, right? So the idea that you might, as a young person, sort of spend some time on the mines, save a house deposit, whatever, and then decide you actually want to be able to coach your kids' soccer team or whatever, and come back and get involved in shipbuilding, that's a beautiful transition. That's a message that industry can sell to the workforce, provided that when we say this is going to be a continuous 30-year employment opportunity for you, it actually is a continuous 30-year employment opportunity for you.
I'd just add to that, though, with the FIFOs, yep, they're a great cohort, but I think what's been missing is this conversation around the defence industry. These are jobs with purpose, and that's what we haven't really sold to the youth out there. These are jobs that are more than, Dale Kerrigan, I dug a hole. These are jobs where I'm working on the world's most complex machine, and I am helping Australia's contribute to Australia's national security. That is a far more compelling argument than, here's your paycheck at the end of 2 weeks. So I think that's really where we have another opportunity we can lean into.
We really need to lead into that, because you're putting an opportunity in front of people that involves a 30% pay cut. So it's got to be substituted by something. And I still don't think we've quite landed. I at one stage said at a conference that, this is the equivalent of creating the submarine enterprise is the equivalent of us creating NASA. And an American from US naval nuclear reactors got really upset with me. He said, don't ever compare us to NASA. When they've got a problem, they come to us. We are much more elite than NASA. But this is it. Like, this is like where, if you get involved in the submarine enterprise in particular, you are being asked to operate at the absolute cutting edge, at the top percentile of anything that's happening in Australia. I don't care whether you're doing payroll or doing, pipes. Whatever you're doing, you're going to be at the absolute top of the enterprise, and it's really exciting. We haven't quite got that out there yet.
Thank you both. I think there were some really interesting examples there that we've given around how government can work better with industry, but also coming back to that question around trust and trust in government that we heard in some of the earlier mini panels. Now, we've talked a lot about industry engagement in the context of defence, but I want to turn towards the ideas around economic resilience and what it means for our economy. Now, we're currently facing a range of interesting economic shocks as a result of conflict in the Middle East. For many of you out there, the question of fuel prices will be, okay, well, is it $2.50 or $2.60 to fill up the car? Or, if you're running on diesel, maybe a little bit more. But for a lot of industries across Australia, they're thinking about not just, do we have the fuel to run the tractors or the trucks, but, where are the inputs that I need for key chemicals or inputs for my manufacturing? And so the energy crisis will have flow-on effects for different sectors of the community. And so I want to turn to our final panel today, which is Jennie and Chris, who are going to talk to us about economic crises. And my first question is, economic crises can act as force multipliers for political instability and social unrest. How well prepared is Australia to absorb major economic shocks?
What a great opening question. Short answer, better prepared than I think we're aware of as the Australian community. But let me take a step back. In this tremendous project from the National Security College, the community consultations, which I haven't had a chance to say it yet. Like, well done! What a tremendous asset for the country. What really struck me is how prominent issues of economics are in the responses. And to me, there is a signal that the Australian community is a bit further ahead than perhaps the policy community is, and we should listen hard. I think economic prosperity ranked second as the priority. I think that's Australians telling us that economic prosperity is not just what security is for. Like, we don't do security in order to get to economic prosperity, but it is security. Okay, and I think that's an interesting shift. Severe economic crisis, I think, also ranked second in the threat concerns. Linked to that first, but that people said they were pretty low in confidence that we were well prepared to approach or manage economic crises. And this is where I think there is a cause for optimism. I think they've got good reason for that perception, because much of that preparedness is pretty opaque, happens behind the scenes. So if I think about the importance of financial system resilience to broader economic resilience and our national project, banks play a crucial role in economic crises as shock absorbers, right? The strong, resilient banks are able to keep lending during downturns, and that softens the downturn. Well-regulated, prudentially managed banks are able to throttle the upturns as well, right? So you get a smoother economic cycle, and that's a good thing. We have unquestionably strong banks in Australia, not by accident or luck, but as a result of very deliberate policy regulatory choices over particularly the last 15 to 20 years. Unquestionably strong is the precise term the regulator APRA uses as the goal for banks. And so as a result, we genuinely do have some of the strongest, most resilient banks in the world. Again, the result of deliberate design choices, not accident. And I think there's some lessons that we can take for other policy domains as we grapple with how to navigate resilience elsewhere. In terms of operational resilience, there is, again, tremendous regulation on the financial system to ensure that banks, super funds, insurers and others not only promise that they can withstand shocks and that their critical systems can continue, but they have to prove it through regular stress testing and risk management overseen by the regulators and others. So the levels of operational resilience are also a strength, I think, that we can draw on. And then if I think about things that otherwise maybe we take for granted in our everyday lives, things like payment systems, which sometimes are described as like the plumbing of the economy, allowing us to buy and sell things. Probably like many of us, I'd never given that very much thought until Russia invaded Ukraine, and as part of the sanctions response, turned off the SWIFT payments to Russia, right? So suddenly this sort of plumbing infrastructure that you take for granted is obvious as a national resilience asset. And Australia has, again, by design and by deliberate choice and very substantial investment over many years, has one of the strongest domestic payment system in the world. That to me gives, that's where a bit of my confidence on some preparedness comes from. Confidence, but not complacency, because of course resilience isn't a one and done endeavour. It needs to continually be nurtured and reinvested in, and that's particularly at a time when in a sense, the surface area of risk is growing. Again, I think there was an APRA stat puts it at about 2/3 of its regulated entities list geopolitical risk as the highest concern. I don't think we would have seen that 10 and 20 years ago. So that risk surface area growing puts an even greater premium on resilience. And this is the last point I'll say. It also highlights the costs of resilience. Right? And I don't say that as some kind of barrier to investing in resilience right across our economy and our country, but that's a policy challenge that we're still in the foothills of on a whole range of other policy domains. I think financial resilience can give us some of the starting points and some of the kind of economics of the costs and who pays in terms of making our society, our country, our communities resilient to a whole range of crises, shocks, some which we can foresee and some which might take us by surprise.
Thanks, Jen. Some heartening words there on the resilience of the financial system. Chris?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I agree with Jen that we're better prepared than most, but that's not good enough, actually. And I think we see it in three different ways. So there are three ways we would think about resilience, and I think about resilience for my clients, kind of leading infrastructure and energy security businesses and governments, ours and others. The first is this. I mean, we're coming from a good place. We've got strong institutions. Jennie's spoken about that. We've got a credible financial position. That's very important. We've got deep pools of domestic capital, yet untapped in many of these aspects, but I'll come to that in a moment. We have traditionally had relatively good access to foreign capital, which is very important for a capital importer like Australia. Human capital, financial capital, physical infrastructure. Human capital, we're not doing well enough. And partly, and it's been alluded to on the panel today, Jennie just alluded to it, a few others have as well. There's the Canberra bubble. Canberra needs to relax a bit. It doesn't have all the answers, and we're not using all the human capital and the horsepower that are at our disposal. The idea that someone who's sitting in a professional services firm in Sydney or Melbourne can't get up to speed on what are seemingly complex pieces of information very, very quickly and provide credible, alternative and creative solutions very, very quickly is ridiculous, quite frankly. That's what we do for a living. We're accountable for it personally, not before a minister, personally. And we do it many, many times a day. And we want to help. The world feels like this. I was saying it to Rory over lunch the other day when I was making this point. 5 or 10 years ago, having worked in lots of different parts of the world, indeed in the part of Ukraine that is currently being occupied by Russia, in lots of countries, in energy security, you really do notice that other countries are better fused than we are, right? And this is a major challenge for us. We must bridge it. The world feels like this. 5 years ago, speaking in a boardroom or to a group like this, but in the business community, I might have been saying we need to prepare. I was. And people thought I was crazy. Now, people say, don't tell us something we already know, right? It feels like this. I went to a pretty tough primary school and high school. You'd turn up on Monday sometimes, and you wouldn't know when. Didn't matter what year you were in. You wouldn't know when, but you knew. Everyone from kindergarten to the high school principal knew at some point that week the two big kids were going to have a fight. They didn't know where. They didn't know if it was going to be behind the toilet block or in the bottom field. The world feels like that now. We all feel it. We all know it. Instinctively, as primates, we all know it. So there's no need hiding it anymore. And we're not accessing that horsepower. We must do that. There are people that can help. And if you go into a boardroom today, it's not about seeking rent. It's not about profits, as Jennie just said. Our directors, our CEOs, the first question they're asking is, what can I do to help? Because they have families, they're deeply invested in here. They might be first generation, they may be new immigrants to Australia, and they're deeply invested in our future. And it is silly of us not to let them make that investment. Everyone needs to have a stake in the success of our country, particularly in a time like this. So that's human capital, financial capital. There needs to be a better synthesis between government and business, and there need to be pathways to mobilise private sector capital, indeed superannuation, in a way that allows us not only to treat critical infrastructure as a vulnerability, but as a strategic asset that provides with real credibility and flexibility in the time of a crisis. And the idea that that critical infrastructure doesn't only exist in Australia, but we as an island in this part of the world have a deep stake in critical infrastructure that is overseas. We need to mobilise our capital to do that. And in order to do that, go to the first point. We need to be able to harness the horsepower of our private sector and get it working with government better to do that. The third point, obviously, is that point around critical infrastructure. So we need to have a conversation with the Australian people. All of our infrastructure has been based on, designed on a framework that has been around allocative efficiency. Our investment bankers have not had to price into their economic models for this infrastructure, world-class infrastructure, the strategic costs or the strategic value of surge capacity, redundance or dual purpose, right? We need to do that. We need to have that conversation with the Australian people. It is more expensive, but the benefits in a world like this, in a mercantilist, dynamic, multi-vector, very rapidly changing environment, the benefits of doing so outweigh the costs. So they're the three, if you like, the three pillars of preparedness that I think we need to address, and it is urgent.
Thanks so much, Chris. You've strayed into my second question, but I'm going to circle back to Jen on this. So, we've talked about preparedness not being completed. It's not something that we tick off. It's something that we continue to practice. But what policies or strategies will best strengthen our economic resilience in the kind of coming global volatile environment?
It's one of my favourite questions. So I'm going to limit myself to my top 6 or something, right, for the sake of time. But, I make a joke, but I say that because, gosh, the field is fertile, right? The problem is not that we don't have the answers or what to do. The problem is maybe prioritisation, maybe responsibility, maybe harnessing some of the incentives and the opportunities before us. But let me start with something that maybe is a little less tangible. And I do think there's a mindset change that is implicit in a lot of what Chris just said, which I agree with hugely. I mean, I suspect there aren't a lot of board directors at the conference. I suspect there aren't a lot of financial regulators at the conference. I suspect there aren't a lot of compliance or security or risk or resilience officers from, top companies with, critical scale in Australia. And I don't say that to be critical at all. This is, the success of this conference shows how good it is at bringing folks together. I just don't think we've really thought in the security world very much about the other agents of security. So I feel like my hope for this project is that it's gone half the way, and it said we need to change the way we think about security and align with what Australians are telling us. We then need to make sure we don't return just to that same group of traditional security players and say, now you deliver this very much more expanded mandate, right? There are strengths right across Australia, including the Australian economy, that our country can harness for this end. Right? Yes, big businesses, big employers, workplaces places of employment are crucial as sites of social cohesion, belonging, respect, connection. Right? They're also crucial channels for reaching customers. We need more of that in places like this. Right? So we need to think of those stakeholders as core to this project as well. There's a bit then in more tangible policy development you could do. I do think there's space for a sort of joined up economic resilience plan, not because writing a plan down on paper is the answer, but because it's part of the way to get what a number of people have spoken about, which is common purpose. We're all going to implement it differently. We're all going to play a different part in that system, but we need some sort of common purpose or some sort of vision of what the mountain we're trying to climb is. I do think we need to continue finding ways to put an economic resilience lens in economic policy. I've alluded to some of the costs there. I still think the challenge of who pays for resilience and how is something that our economic policy frameworks struggle with. And I say that not because then that's a barrier we should walk away from, but that's a problem we should lean hard into and work out how to solve. Chris said something really interesting about the kind of instincts or the natural incentives of boardrooms in kind of wanting to help in this space, not coming from a sort of, charitable position alone, but there's strong self-interest from all of us as Australians to lean into Australia's security and resilience. National institutions are crucial in that. And national institutions are not just public, right? They're private sector institutions, they're civic institutions, but they are large and at scale. And we should think hard about that national institutional capacity, because in times of crisis, it is national institutions that step forward. It is, in times of economic crisis, it is Australia's big banks, for instance, that Treasury will want to call, not Apple, right? And we need to think hard about what that means for capacity in the good times. And the final one, let me say something about AI. I think, tremendous potential for productivity and growth still to be worked out, the precise contours of that. It's another place we need a resilience lens, which is different from safety, right? Also important, but different from safety, to ensure that the kind of economic value of the AI transformation is captured in Australia and shared widely among Australians, not siphoned back offshore.
Jen, thanks for those really tangible suggestions of how we can kind of build in that economic resilience. Chris, is there anything else you wanted to add there on your points earlier?
I don't know if there is much more to add. I mean, I completely agree with everything you've said, Jen. I think it's just an excellent synopsis, actually, of where we are, right? I would just go to that point around, and I suspect it's only elaborating a little more on what Jen has already said. Giving everyone a feeling like they have a real stake in the success of the outcome here, right? And that's more than merely your mortgage, right? It is. And so giving everyone that feeling that they have ownership. There are a few ways you can do that. I think the national organisation piece is so important, fundamentally important. And the idea that doesn't only exist in a political or a policy sphere, but that exists at many different levels, community, business. Absolutely, 100%. Second, there is I'm reading a little bit about a guy called Essington Lewis at the moment who helped us prepare in World War II, this idea comes through around making sure that people are deeply invested in that outcome, and it just occurs to me that. And there's a tension here, and Jennie will know better than I do. But that through our superannuation, we might be able to provide a greater socialisation, right, of the risk, and a greater feeling of co-ownership of success through strategic investment of superannuation, facilitated by government, in these endeavours, but in a way that allows superannuation to remain committed to the investment test, which is it's got to be in the interest of the investors as well. We've got to do that. And so I won't go into it now, but we are working, at our firm, we are working on 2 or 3 mechanisms that achieve that and we're socialising them, they are effectively like a 21st century war bond, right? And it's aimed at getting not really at the weapon systems and whatnot, that's for defence budget, but it's aimed at alleviating the pressure on the defence budget, mobilising the 1.5%, because that's what the 1.5%, the NOTA 5% is for, and allowing us to have that stake, allowing us to achieve that return, and to put into action capital to get our critical infrastructure defence ready for surge, redundancy, and dual use, not just to protect it against vulnerability, which is also very important. So that's what we're doing, and that's a good example of a business, right? We're not getting paid for that. That's a good example of a business that is committed to our country, and we're, harnessing the horsepower of 100 partners to work at it, right? Not just any 100 partners either. So it's that's the sort of thing. These are the sorts of things people want to help.
Thanks so much, Chris and Jennie, for that additional panel. So we have covered a lot of ground here. We've covered so many different aspects of national security and resilience. What I've found interesting, actually, is that there's been actually quite a lot to celebrate and quite a lot to be hopeful about. I think we're not being optimistic, we're being confident, I think was the term. So that's a really great message to end on. The topic of this presentation was common security, but I actually think we've come together around common purpose. We've heard from such a diverse range of experts today on many different issues, but we have really come back to some core messages around trust, around resilience, around democracy, and about finding our humanity. Can I ask you to join me in thanking our panellists?